This week on Quest, sea otters combating climate change,
To see that change almost overnight was amazing.
cars fueled by hydrogen,
I was promised flying cars when I was a kid. This is as close as it's going to get.
and scientists trying to build a more resilient forest.
Some of the best old growth stands that we have are in the Menominee tribal land.
Major funding for Quest is provided by the National Science Foundation.
Known as Science on a Sphere, giant digital globes, just like this one at the Lawrence Hall of Science in Berkeley, California, can be found at science centers around the world. They reveal breathtaking views of Earth from space and enable us to visualize global trends, like the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that's causing our climate to change. The huge data sets used to create these visual models can also help us predict and prepare for the impacts of these changes on our environment, our health, our supplies of food and water, and our livelihoods. And here's some more encouraging news. Because we know why the planet is warming, we also know what we can do to slow its progress. This episode of Quest begins in the waters off the coast of Washington State, where sea otters are playing a surprising role in combating climate change.
It's a beautiful day on the Washington coast. But these hikers aren't here for the spectacular views.
I think there's a group of like 4.
It's grooming like crazy, so it's probably getting ready to rest. Just coming up onto the rock. Oh, it's got a pup. Each year in July, we do this annual census. Yeah, we've got 3 adults.
For nearly 40 years, Ron Jameson has been monitoring the size and health of Washington's sea otter populations.
Most years we can get up to, 130, 150 sea otters.
And new research suggests more reasons to keep an eye on them. It turns out that otters play a key role in combating climate change by protecting underwater kelp forests. Like all plants, kelp sequesters carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to create its leafy structure. In fact, kelp forests are one of the world's most efficient absorbers of CO2. But kelp forests need sea otters around to defend them from predators. And the survival of otters has been anything but guaranteed. From the mid-1700s to the early 1900s, sea otters were widely hunted for their luxuriant fur.
It was the most valuable fur that fur traders could get their hands on. And many sea otter populations were wiped out throughout their range from Russia and Japan all the way through Alaska and all along the west coast of the United States, including Northern California, Oregon, and Washington.
By the end of the fur trade in 1911, only about 1,000 sea otters remained in the entire North Pacific Ocean. But in the 1960s and early 1970s, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and several state agencies set about restoring them to their former range.
The C-130 cargo aircraft can accommodate 60 sea otters.
Some 700 sea otters were captured in Alaska and relocated to Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia.
They're in good condition when they arrive, and they take to the waters of Oregon as if this were their home.
Only about a few dozen sea otters were moved to Washington State, and of those, we think about a dozen survived to found the population that now numbers 1,100 animals off the coast of Washington.
Since 1989, Washington's sea otter population has grown roughly 8% a year. It's one of the healthiest populations on the West Coast. That's good news, not just for the otters, but also for the kelp. Because sea otters love to eat a creature that threatens these underwater forests. Sea urchins are small, spiky creatures that play a surprisingly large role in the kelp forest ecosystem. If left unchecked, urchins will devour kelp at an astonishing rate. Fortunately, urchins are a favorite food of sea otters.
Sea otters have a very high metabolism, and they eat up to 25% of their body weight per day. And when the sea otters go down and remove those urchins, you end up actually having a big growth or bloom of that kelp because it no longer has urchins to kind of graze it down.
And when sea otter predation is removed, the urchin populations just basically explode. They become so abundant that they can actually graze the ocean bottom down to what's often referred to as urchin barrens.
And then it just looks like an underwater desert with just urchins there.
Bob Sizemore counts sea urchins off the Washington coast to keep tabs on the size of the population.
We began doing these surveys in the early 1980s. So we have almost 35 years of data so that we can track the population when it goes up and when it goes down, and then try to assign a reason why that's happening. When I started here in the early 1990s, urchins were very abundant throughout the entire Strait of Juan de Fuca. There was urchins everywhere. They've been called carpets of urchins.
These herds of urchins occur when an ecosystem falls out of balance. In healthy systems, sea otters and other top predators keep urchin populations in check. That allows kelp to grow and sequester more carbon. In Washington state, in the mid-1990s, a group of more than 100 sea otters wandered into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. They stayed there for more than 3 months, feasting on urchins.
We heard about this sea otters coming in, and so we went back into that location and surveyed again. And what we found was amazing. Basically, the sea urchins were gone. The only sea urchins we saw were very tiny ones, and they were tucked up inside the cracks and crevices of rocks.
In a matter of weeks, these otters devoured up to 1 million pounds of urchin.
To see that change almost overnight was amazing as biologists and as just a diver. It was a pretty dramatic change.
As West Coast sea otter populations have rebounded, so have the kelp forests. And it's having a measurable impact on climate change. According to a recent study, kelp forests can absorb up to 12 times more atmospheric CO2 when sea otters are keeping watch. And all that carbon can really add up. The carbon sequestered each year by North Pacific kelp is equivalent to taking as many as 6 million passenger cars off the road.
We know that top predators play a big role in ecosystems. Sea otters are an example where they really could have an effect on carbon storage because of the blooms in kelp with their presence. And I think most certainly there are other possibilities in either marine or terrestrial systems where that could be the case. If conserving a predator can also have a positive impact on carbon storage or on kind of fighting climate change, that's certainly a win-win.
It was one of those situations where human beings were able to right something that was wrong. And we don't get that opportunity very often, and often when we try to do something like that, we fail. In this case, I think we succeeded.
Once you fall in love with penguins, it's really hard to leave them. My name is Dee Boersma, and I've been studying penguins for over 40 years. People don't often think about penguins being similar to humans, but they really are. They walk upright, they're often comical. Many of them are faithful. They're trying to find food, they're trying to find shelter, and they're trying to raise a family. Scientifically, they're really interesting because they're ocean sentinels. They tell us a lot about what's happening in the marine environment, and in many cases, what's happening in the land environment as well. Unfortunately, with global climate change, food is scarce, threatening the penguin's survival. When I first went to the Galapagos, I counted noses, because we had no idea how many Galapagos penguins there are. I counted more than 2,000. There are years after El Nino where we count a little over 400. These penguins need dry, shady nests to breed successfully. With erosion and rising sea levels, there simply aren't enough good natural nest sites anymore. We realized that maybe if we built nests for the penguins, we could actually increase the population. Our hope is that when conditions are good, everybody that wants to breed can breed. It was just so exciting when we saw one of these nests that we built that had an egg in it. Here's the eggshell. 56 grams, gained 10 grams since yesterday, and it's all gone to his little stomach. It just makes you realize that if you give them a little help, we might have these penguins around for many, many more generations.
Maybe you or someone you know has been thinking of buying a car, one that doesn't run exclusively on gasoline, perhaps an electric car or a plug-in hybrid, or one that runs on biodiesel. Alternative fuel sources like these hold great potential to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S., 30% of which are attributed to transportation. Another alternative fuel option, one that emits only water vapor, has been in development for decades, but hasn't yet made it to market. So what's the holdup? Next we go to California, where a fleet of cars fueled by hydrogen may finally be ready to roll.
I'm Bill Holloway. I live here in Alameda, in California. I drive a very rare car. There's only a handful on lease here in Northern California. I didn't want a plain electric car. Most electric cars can't make my daily commute, which is 150 miles round trip. The economy in this Mercedes is great. I average 58 miles per kilogram of hydrogen, which is the same as 58 miles per gallon in gas.
Holloway drives a fuel cell vehicle. It uses hydrogen instead of gasoline for fuel, and it emits only water vapor instead of harmful pollution.
I picked a hydrogen car because I was able to drive one of the early experimental models, and I'm kind of a geek.
Car makers have spent more than a decade and invested billions of dollars to develop the technology.
Having been involved in this now for 15 years and seeing the evolution of the technology, these guys are serious. They really see the fuel cell vehicle as the future of automotive technology, and you will see that in the commercial products that come out.
In 2014, Hyundai will release a new fuel cell SUV in California, followed by new models from Toyota and Honda in 2015. But even with the rollout of these new hydrogen cars, drivers may hit a roadblock when it's time to refuel.
My biggest complaint about this fuel cell car, and fuel cell cars in general, is there's nowhere to fill them up.
For now, there's just one place he can go to refuel his car in Northern California, at this station in Emeryville, owned and operated by AC Transit. 12 of its public buses run on hydrogen. At the hydrogen pump, filling up is remarkably similar to filling up at a regular gas station.
It only takes 4 or 5 minutes to fill, the same as filling up a regular gasoline car, so I had to make no adjustments at all.
On a per-mile basis, hydrogen costs about as much as gasoline. And like gasoline, hydrogen is flammable. But it disperses quickly if it leaks because it is lighter than air.
I never worried about the safety of the hydrogen. The hydrogen tanks are buried in the middle, in the safest place in the car.
The tanks also store hydrogen at high pressure, a recent innovation that has doubled the driving range of fuel cell cars.
What's very different now than several years ago is that we're able to store a lot more hydrogen on board the vehicle because we've gone to higher storage pressures that are now giving us a driving range of 250 or even 300 miles.
Most battery electric cars can only travel 80 or so miles before needing to be recharged for several hours. A fuel cell car also needs electricity to power its electric motor. But here, the electricity is made on board from hydrogen inside a fuel cell stack.
Here is a fuel cell stack that's very similar to the type that you'd see in a fuel cell powered car. Each cell has a special membrane material in the middle that splits the hydrogen molecules into protons and electrons. The protons are now charged particles called ions that can go through this membrane material, but the electrons cannot.
So the electrons go around the membrane and generate electricity. Oxygen from the air also flows in and binds with the electrons and ions to produce water and heat, the only tailpipe emissions. Like plug-in Toyota Priuses and battery-electric Nissan Leafs, fuel cell cars are called zero-emission vehicles since they emit no pollutants or carbon dioxide.
Hydrogen fuel cell vehicles can be zero-emission vehicles, but the only way you can do that is to use a renewable source for the hydrogen, and that could be solar power or wind power.
Still, most hydrogen generated in the U.S. is made with methane, a natural gas.
Even though there's some CO2 produced from that process, it's still about 50% less than burning gasoline in a combustion engine.
In October 2013, California, Oregon, and 6 other states pledged to put more than 3 million zero-emission vehicles on their roads by 2025. With the nation's largest car market and its tough air quality standards, California is critical to the success of fuel cell cars and the infrastructure the cars require to take off.
I can't go on a long trip. If they had more fueling stations, they would have more cars they could sell. If there were more cars, they would have more fueling stations. We have a chicken and egg problem.
So in 2013, Governor Jerry Brown signed a new law that provides $20 million a year to build at least 100 hydrogen refueling stations in California by 2024. 19 new stations are already in development.
The state funding helps offset the risk to these small and medium-sized businesses to make this investment to move forward with hydrogen fuel technology.
Still, some question the use of public dollars to help build hydrogen stations.
The state wants to build hydrogen fueling infrastructure with no knowledge as to whether there's going to be a significant number of vehicles that will use those. It's a recipe for risking taxpayer funds for what may be a total waste of money.
And this isn't the first time California has tried to promote a vision of a hydrogen highway.
All across our highway system, hundreds of hydrogen fueling stations will be built.
Arnold Schwarzenegger's plan relied on private investors to help build up to 100 hydrogen stations by 2010. But the plan failed.
I think the original plan timing was ambitious, and I think that the cars really have come so far since the 2004 plan was established.
Even so, will drivers choose hydrogen when electric cars and other clean vehicles are already on the road?
A few quick things about the car before we get in and let you drive. When people get to test drive these cars, they'll be very impressed by the performance, by how similar they are to conventional vehicles.
See inside, it looks just like a regular car with a gas pedal and a brake. There's an emergency brake if you need it.
I was promised flying cars when I was a kid. This is as close as it's going to get. This actually stands a chance of being the car of the future, the fuel cell cars.
Trees are part of the lush tapestry of vegetation covering some 25% of the Earth's surface. They improve our quality of life, offering countless benefits to our communities and to the environment. Trees provide habitat for wildlife, prevent soil erosion, and purify the air we breathe. They can even help slow the rate of climate change by absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. In Wisconsin, forestry experts are drawing on both old traditions and new research to figure out how we can continue reaping the many benefits of our cherished trees as we face a warmer future.
A tree falls in the forest, but not just any tree. One specifically marked for harvest, and not just from any forest. This is the forest that's home to the Menominee people.
A lot of them say the forest is them, and it's been here, it's their inheritance.
Inherited from ancestors like Chief Oshkosh, who negotiated to keep the reservation in northeast Wisconsin in 1854. Oshkosh also said if they cut selectively toward the setting sun to the end of the forest and turned back to the rising sun, the trees would last forever.
At first glance, it looks like a forest that hasn't been managed. It's anything but that.
Although the technology has changed, Oshkosh's sustainable strategy is still in play, allowing the tribe to harvest timber and mill much of it themselves, creating jobs and economic opportunity on the reservation. The forest now actually holds more timber than when they started, and is better equipped than many forests in Wisconsin to withstand the impacts of a changing climate.
As Chief of the Forest Service, I look at the Menominee as a real success story. Some of the best old growth stands that we have are in the Menominee tribal land.
Old growth, or forests that include trees that are hundreds of years old like the Menominee, are very rare in Wisconsin and the Great Lakes states. In the 19th century, large-scale timbering began, and most of the region's great pine forests were simply clear-cut.
In about 50 years, all of the forests of northern Wisconsin were cut. And it was very destructive. It was not managed or regulated in any way.
Northern Wisconsin became known as the cutover. After efforts to farm it failed, it was eventually reforested. But climate change poses a new threat to these younger forests. Younger forests are less resilient than older ones because they are less diverse. Largely comprised of single tree species, these forests are at risk if those species can't thrive in warmer temperatures or survive more frequent droughts.
Maybe by 100 years, we'll really start to lose a lot of our, what we consider sort of iconic northern species, which are the evergreens, the spruce, the fir, paper birch, aspen might be lost.
And it's not only growing conditions that may change, warmer temperatures also promote the spread of diseases and invasive species.
Every species has an invasive species after it.
But the fates of these younger forests are not yet sealed, and a group of University of Wisconsin scientists have embarked on a long-term study to see if they can make younger forests behave more like older forests, to become more diverse and, therefore, more resilient. It's an experiment in the Flambeau River State Forest, a young forest mostly made up of sugar maple, about 150 miles northwest of the Menominee. In older growth forests, diversity develops over time as larger trees get knocked over by wind, creating openings in the canopy. These gaps let in sunlight, which creates better conditions for other kinds of tree species that require more light and warmth. In the Flambeau experiment, canopy gaps have been artificially created to mimic what happens in the more diverse older growth forest.
We're inside the exclosure.
Okay, we're inside the big one.
Inside the big one. He's heading towards the...
Already there are other species growing up in the larger gaps where light is allowed to penetrate. The scientists hope that making this forest more diverse will help it stay healthy despite the impacts of global warming. And there is an added bonus. The world's forests absorb 2.5 billion tons of carbon every year. So by preserving more trees, we can actually help slow the rate of climate change.
Climate change is essentially a disruption of the carbon cycle. And what are forests so particularly good at? Storing carbon, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis and sequestering it or storing it in tree trunks, in leaves, in root mass, in the biomass of the forest floor.
How all those elements of the forest store and release carbon is being measured in the Flambeau experiment. Data is being collected to determine which factors maximize carbon storage, like how big the canopy gap should be, and how much wood should be left to decay. Eventually, the results can inform how forests are best managed for carbon capture. But like anything involving trees, it will take time. The research is planned as a 50-year study.
The way the climate is warming, potentially we have less than a half century to really try to do something about it.
It's been more than a century and a half since Oshkosh's time, and the Menominee people and their forest have endured.
I think seeing the forest and seeing it held intact, I think, has enabled the Menominee to maintain their cultural identity.
Welcome to the land of Menominee. It's great to see you all here
Recently, the Menominee hosted the annual meeting of the Intertribal Timber Council. They were able to show off their forest to other tribes from the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, and the South.
It's like this, you can grow a number of different species. You can grow white pine.
But it was also a time to talk about the shared struggles of managing resources in uncertain times.
Some of these new challenges of sustainability are probably new in our lifetimes.
Challenges that will require drawing on both traditional practices and cutting-edge research to ensure the future of our forests.
Some of these answers lie within different communities that maybe help resolve these daunting questions about climate change. So I think it's getting back to that and reassuring ourselves that a solution is not impossible.
To find out more about the future of our forests or any of Quest's TV, radio, and web stories, visit questscience.org and use our social media tools to join the conversation. For Quest, I'm Simran Sethi.
Major funding for Quest is provided by the National Science Foundation.